control the vertical.
Welcome to Anthologic, the TV anthology podcast. I am your host, Mark. Anthologic is a podcast dedicated to exploring the good, the bad, and the odd of horror, science fiction, and the best of mystery suspense anthology shows and series on TV. Join me as we slip through the cracks of reality to approach the extremes of experience, where we can peruse the stories and art of a sinister fairground of strange and wonderful rides. And now we go on to the show that is the focus of this particular episode. Welcome to this episode of Anthologic with your host Mark. Today we are talking about The Outer Limits. We're on episode 18 of The Outer Limits, which is called ZZZZZ. 5 Z's, to make it clear. Directed by John Brahm, written by Maya Malinsky, with some interception by Joseph Stefano. Cinematographer by Conrad Hall, who's done a lot of these. It was actually 21 in production code, but it was aired as the 18th episode. First aired on January 27th, 1964. It's really got very few actors in. I think there's 4 in all. 5 in all. And it involves a scientist who's an entomologist who's interested in bees, who has asked his wife to put an ad in a local shop or in a newspaper, to get an assistant. But this woman turns up. But we see her. She actually kind of evolves in the garden from a bee. She somehow turns into this woman who then presents herself saying, "Yeah, I know you want an assistant." And the wife said, "Well, we haven't advertised yet." And she said, "Oh, I overheard your wife placed the ad." And I thought I'd be suitable. Now, she's a very attractive woman, very vivacious and shapely as well. But she just turns up in the garden. And Ben Fields, the scientist, is kind of taken with her. His wife, and he's talking to her. And then his wife, Francesca, turns up and sort of says, "Well, I haven't placed the ad yet." And she goes, "I overheard it." But some stuff comes back later on to sort of try and blow a hole in that story, actually, which I'll get to. Now, it's interesting. I think the story is written around Joanna Frank. They wanted to use Joanna Frank in something because she's quite a striking-looking woman. She's got a very kind of exotic look. Now, she's not a great actress, but that was fine for this episode because she had to play someone who wasn't strictly human. Somewhat different, and so her acting ability suited that vibe. So it was quite cool. And we get Philip Abbott and Marsha Hunt as Ben and Francesca Fields. Now, when you watch this, it feels like the writing is for a younger couple, and I think it was, but they still cast them. These 2 actors who are solid actors. I kind of see why they were cast. But the script certainly feels like it should be for a younger couple. They're discussing certain things. However, that kind of gets switched around later on because they actually briefly talk about a daughter that they had who would have been the age of this woman that's turned up if she'd have lived. So, okay, I can see for that plot element alone, I can see they needed an older couple. And as I say, Joanna Frank has turned up as this Queen Bee, as it were, in human form, and she's called Regina, Latin for queen, interestingly. Apparently she was originally called Doris, so Regina does work way better with what's going on. So she starts being the assistant, and they talk about bees, and we discover he's worked out how to communicate with bees. This thing literally turns the humming of the bees into English. So we can sort of say, invader, because he, for example, he demonstrates to Regina, he's introducing a fake bee with different pheromones and stuff. And when the bee is put in the hive, you can hear the bees sort of saying, invader, alert, quick, go to this, all that sort of stuff is going on. So it's kind of interesting. There's lots of discussions going on. Now, originally, apparently, the script was more oriented discussing the nature of matriarchy, and there's some interesting lines that I don't think we used about matriarchy, but and when it was first submitted, Stefano did not like some elements of it, and he kind of switched it to be more about the sanctity of marriage and matrimony than matriarchy. So he turned it from a sort of much more interesting but possibly more transgressive kind of script to something a little more mainstream, and I think we'd have got a much more interesting sort of stuff going on if that switch hadn't been made. But having said that, I do like this episode. It is kind of a fun one. It's memorable, and apparently Joanna Frank comments that sometimes she would, for many years after, get seen in the supermarket and someone would say, "You're the bee lady." So there is that. Now, Regina is also, she is a bee that somehow turns into a human form. And they kind of play this off at the beginning by putting a monologue that says, as we experiment on the lower forms, is it possible the lower forms are also doing their own experiments and that maybe they'll succeed? So that's the premise, right? But it's fantasy. This is not sci-fi, it's fantasy. But she has a number of issues with her human form. She's not quite sure how to conduct herself. There's a point she gets a stomach pain and she can't deal with it, and it turns out it's just a bit of food poisoning. But when the doctor examines her, he kind of does actually say to Ben, okay, she looks human, but she's the most extreme mutant I've ever seen. Those are his words, right? Those are his words. So there's something going on. Also, Francesca is getting more and more suspicious of Regina. Like, how did she find out? For example, she says things like, but I didn't go in and place the ad. I found it in, and Regina says, "Yeah, I overheard the girl taking your ad, and she confided in me." And immediately, Francesca's like, "I didn't do it to a girl. It was Mr. So and so." And Regina immediately comes back with, "Oh, I didn't want to embarrass him. A break of confidence. I was just trying to protect him." So she's very sharp. Considering she's like new to this game, new to humanity. So it's kind of interesting that she's that sharp. Kind of suggests she's super intelligent, perhaps. But in the meantime, Regina's making a play for her husband. So in many respects, this is a story about the concerns of a wife, perhaps, or of possible adultery, right? There's that kind of vibe going on. She's suspicious. If a beautiful woman just turns up and says, "I want to work for you," to her husband, a wife will have issues, I believe. I think that's perfectly natural and would create an issue. And vice versa, if the genders were swapped, it would be the same thing. So Francesca's kind of aware that Regina's making a play for her husband. Then finally, Regina gets the hive to attack Francesca and kills her. Quite an effective attack sequence. She's never in the same shop with her bees, but we do see swarms of bees flying around and her like rattling a gate like she's locked, can't get through a locked gate. She dies, and then what happens is Regina turns up with a wedding vow. His dead wife's wedding vow, and he gets really upset, and she says, "But I just want to make you happy," and there's all this kind of dialogue. It's quite good dialogue, I have to say. It's quite good dialogue, and it's quite well shot. They do some interesting lighting around Regina's eyes to give it a kind of a weird effect as well. So sometimes she could turn into a bee. Oh, I should mention, there's one point Francesca sees her licking flowers. That's a really transgressive element, actually. And as she's licking flowers, she turns into a bee, a giant bee, and Francesca faints, but doesn't mention it. That's the weird thing. She doesn't mention it after that. After she's lying in bed and Ben's visited her, but she never mentions what caused her to have this turn. Presumably the shock made her forget it, I guess, is the idea. I'm not really sure. And in the end, Ben gives this speech about matrimony and how important it is. Again, we're veering into more sort of acceptable mainstream kind of dialogue rather than the stuff about matriarchy. There was some interesting dialogue I read that was not used, where Ben talks about I would submit to a matriarchy if I believed the matriarch was, if I was convinced she knew what she was doing, kind of thing. It's kind of an interesting and odd sort of talk. But in the end, Regina kind of falls backwards. It's not quite clear if Ben kind of forces her back, and is just so angry she's backing away. She falls over a balcony, lands on the grass, turns into a bee in a really bad effect, and kind of flies off, presumably to go. The idea is she wants to mate with a human to produce some sort of hybrid race, so the bees can continue evolving or something like that. It really isn't that clear. There's a final closing narration, which is talking about lovelessness in mating rather than love. That's the vibe. So quite conservative, really. This is it. When the yearning to gain ascendancy takes the form of a soulless, loveless struggle, the contest must end in unlovely defeat. For without love, drones can never be men, and men can only be drones. So, it's going, love. It's all about that, right? Memorable episode, not well executed, as I say. I think the Stefano changes kind of derailed what could have been a much more interesting script. But overall, I like this. Regina, played by Joanna Frank, is very memorable as a character. But there's all sorts of silliness, talking to the bees for a sort of conversion. That was silly and stuff like that. But in principle, I kind of liked it. It does play into a lot of... I mean, isn't there like a Attack of the Bee Women or something like that? Sort of Z movie, a B movie, sci-fi B movie, tapping into a similar vein. So it kind of feels like it's in the same space as this does. But yeah, it was okay. I quite liked it. I'll remember it for a fair bit of time, I think, after this. But I can't say it's a great episode. Okay, that's it from me. But before I go, may I ask, is there anybody out there?
I'm not.
We now return control of your television set to you until next week at this same time, when the control voice will take you to